Please subscribe the channel, like and share the video. For more video, you can think of this as the first long drift into sleep. More parts would naturally follow. Part 1. What did ancient China concubines actually do all day? Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back, far back, past emails, past deadlines, past whatever you forgot to do today but will absolutely not be doing right now. So lower the lights, let your shoulders drop, and if your phone falls on your face halfway through, well, history claims another victim. Tonight, we're heading into ancient China. Not the loud parts, not the battles, or the revolutions, or the shouting men on horseback. We're going somewhere quieter. We're going behind the walls, behind the gates, into the carefully regulated stillness of the imperial harem, and we're asking a deceptively simple question. What did imperial concubines actually do all day? Because the popular imagination has ideas, endless intrigue, seduction, poisoned cups of tea, sharp smiles behind silk fans, and yes, some of that happened. Naturally, it made everything worse, but most days were long, slow, painfully repetitive, and that's where we'll begin. First, we need to set the scene. The imperial palace was not a home, it was a system, a beautifully decorated, heavily ritualized machine designed to manage people, specifically women, at scale. High walls sealed it off from the outside world, gates were guarded, movement was logged, access was controlled. Once a woman entered the harem, she did not simply leave again. This was not a phase, it was a permanent condition. Some concubines entered as teenagers, some even younger. They would grow old inside the same walls, watching seasons change through the same courtyards, until eventually they disappeared into the background of history, which, in many ways, was exactly the point. Now, the word concubine can be misleading. These women were not casual companions, they were not unofficial. Concubinage in imperial China was a legal, bureaucratic institution with ranks, titles, rules, and paperwork. So much paperwork. At the top of the hierarchy sat the empress. There was only one. This was very important. Below her were consorts of various ranks, then concubines, then lower-ranking women whose titles translated to something like present but not significant. Everyone knew exactly where they stood, and they were reminded constantly. So let's follow a typical day, a very typical day, which is to say, a quiet one. Most concubines woke before sunrise, not because they wanted to, but because the palace schedule did. Attendants entered softly, curtains were drawn back, hair was arranged, faces were powdered. This was done regardless of whether the concubine was seeing anyone that day, because looking appropriate was not about being admired, it was about being ready, at all times, for everything or nothing. Once dressed, a concubine would wait. This waiting was not metaphorical, it was literal. Waiting for instructions, waiting for summons, waiting for time to pass. Some women waited in their chambers, some walked slowly through courtyards, some sat near ponds, watching fish glide through water with what could only be described as envy. Occasionally, there were lessons. Etiquette lessons were constant. How to bow, how deeply, at what angle, to whom, which foot moved first, where the eyes were allowed to rest, how long one could speak. Silence, it turned out, was a skill, and a necessary one. Education was encouraged but selectively. Reading was acceptable, as long as it was the right kind of reading. Confucian classics, moral texts, poetry emphasizing restraint, humility, and knowing one's place. Music was permitted. Soft instruments, nothing too lively. Calligraphy was ideal. It trained patience, control, and the ability to sit still for very long periods of time without complaint, which, conveniently, was the entire job. Now, you might assume that with so many women living together, there was constant conversation, and there was some, but every word was weighed. The palace was a place where listening could be dangerous. Walls had ears, so did servants, so did eunuchs. And we'll talk about eunuchs properly later, because they deserve their own very quiet, very unsettling chapter. For now, just know this: they controlled access, they controlled information, and they remembered everything. Most concubines never saw the emperor. This surprises people. An emperor might have dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of women attached to his household. Even with enthusiasm, history suggests enthusiasm was inconsistent. The numbers simply didn't work. Selection was regulated. Astrologers consulted charts. Officials tracked dates. Eunuchs maintained schedules. Romance did not enter into it. If a concubine was chosen for the night, she would be notified hours in advance. This notification transformed the atmosphere around her. Attendance became tense. Movements became careful. Voices dropped. She would bathe, dress, wait, again, and then be escorted, sometimes carried to the emperor's chambers. The encounter itself was brief, ritualized, documented. Names, times, dates, romantic. It was not. Afterward, life returned to waiting. Unless she became pregnant. This changed everything. Suddenly, she mattered, not as a person, but as a possibility. If she bore a son, her status rose, sometimes dramatically. If that son survived infancy, which was never guaranteed, she might be promoted, moved to better quarters, granted more servants. If she bore a daughter, the palace politely adjusted its expectations downward, and if she bore no children at all, then she returned to the background, where most concubines lived most of their lives. Friendships existed. They had to. People are social creatures, even in systems designed to isolate them. Concubines formed quiet alliances, shared food, shared information. They warned each other about which eunuch was in a bad mood, which consort was rising, which rumor was circulating, because rumors were currency, and silence was dangerous. As women aged, their visibility faded. Younger concubines arrived, fresh faces, new attention. Older women were reassigned, moved to outer sections of the palace. Some taught etiquette, some took religious vows, some simply existed, quietly, until history forgot them completely. Leaving the palace was rare. Marriage outside was almost unheard of. This was not a chapter of life. It was the whole book. So when we ask what ancient Chinese concubines did all day, the answer is not intrigue. It is routine, structure, control. They woke, they dressed, they practiced, they waited. They lived inside a system that prized order over happiness, harmony over humanity. And in the next part, we'll drift into what happened when that waiting turned into rivalry, when boredom met ambition, when silence began to crack. But for now, let your thoughts slow. Imagine the quiet courtyards, the measured footsteps, the endless waiting, and we'll continue very soon. Welcome back. If you dozed off during part 1, congratulations, you're experiencing this exactly as intended. Nothing says authentic imperial concubine experience like losing track of time, while absolutely nothing changes. Now that we've settled into the daily rhythm of waiting, we can gently introduce the thing that made all that waiting unbearable: rank. Because humans, as it turns out, can endure almost anything, as long as no one else is doing slightly better than they are. And in the imperial harem, someone was always doing slightly better. The harem was not chaos, it was worse. It was organized. Every woman had a title. Every title had a number. Every number came with privileges or the lack thereof. Rank determined everything. How large your room was, how close it was to the center of the palace, how many servants you were assigned, what color silk you were allowed to wear, how warm your food arrived, even how loudly people spoke to you, which is a remarkably efficient way to remind someone of their place without ever saying it out loud. The empress, of course, sat at the top. There was only one. This was deliberate. She was the official wife, the symbol of order, the woman everyone else was not. Below her were consorts of various grades, each one carefully ranked, labeled, and monitored. Then came the concubines, and below them, the women, whose names barely appeared in records at all. They existed, they waited, and history shrugged. Movement between ranks was technically possible. This was very important for morale. In practice, it was rare. A concubine might be promoted after bearing a son, or after a period of sustained imperial favor. But favor was a slippery thing. It arrived suddenly, and it left even faster. And when it left, everyone noticed. Rivalry in the harem was not loud. There were no shouting matches in hallways, no dramatic confrontations that would have been vulgar and punished. Instead, rivalry took the form of adjustments. A message delivered late, a rumor quietly repeated, a small mistake gently reported to the right person. Nothing dramatic, just enough. Because in a system this tightly controlled, even a minor infraction could become a major problem. Eunuchs played a central role here. They were messengers, supervisors, gatekeepers. They knew who was favored, they knew who was falling, and they knew who was pretending not to care. Which, for the record, was everyone. A concubine who offended the wrong eunuch might find her name misfiled, her request delayed, her status quietly eroded. On paper, nothing had changed. In reality, everything had favor from the emperor was the most dangerous thing of all, because it came with attention, and attention attracted enemies. A single night of imperial interest could elevate a concubine standing overnight. Suddenly, people smiled more, bowed deeper, listened carefully, and just as suddenly, they watched, because everyone knew the pattern. Today, it's you. Tomorrow, someone younger. Naturally, this created a delightful atmosphere of quiet tension. Imagine being 16. You've been in the palace for 3 years. You've memorized every rule, perfected every bow, learned how to disappear politely, and then a new girl arrives. She's younger, her skin hasn't learned despair yet, and everyone knows exactly what that means. You smile, you welcome her, you offer advice, and you begin preparing for irrelevance. Some concubines tried to stand out, others did the opposite. They made themselves forgettable, because being unnoticed was sometimes safer than being admired. Beauty attracted attention. Attention attracted scrutiny. Scrutiny attracted problems. So some women dressed plainly, spoke less, smiled softly. Survival, not success, was the goal. And then there was the ultimate shift in power. Pregnancy. A concubine who became pregnant stopped being just another woman in silk. She became a potential mother of an heir. Everything changed. Her diet, her guards, her attention, and the pressure. Because childbirth was dangerous, infant survival was uncertain, and the palace was not sentimental. If the child lived, especially if it was a boy, status rose. If the child died, the palace moved on quickly. This is where rivalry sharpened, not openly, but invisibly. Who controlled access to the mother? Who prepared the food? Who whispered what to whom? No one needed to act dramatically. The system did the work for them. All of this existed under the banner of harmony, Confucian ideals, order, balance, which is fascinating, considering how deeply anxious everyone was. But that was the genius of it, a system that looked calm, while quietly pressurizing everyone inside it. And pressure, as we know, never stays contained forever. In the next part, we'll drift toward the women who learned to use this system, not to survive it, but to bend it. The concubines who stopped waiting and started planning. But not yet. For now, let your thoughts slow again. Picture the palace at night, lanterns glowing, footsteps soft, and dozens of women lying awake, calculating. We'll continue soon. By now, the pattern should feel familiar. Waiting, watching, quiet calculations made behind calm expressions, and eventually, if luck, timing, astrology, and sheer randomness aligned, something happened. A pregnancy. In the imperial harem, this was the closest thing to a plot twist anyone ever experienced. Not because it was joyful, but because it was consequential. The moment a concubine was suspected of being pregnant, her life shifted. Not gently, abruptly. Doctors were summoned. Eunuchs took notes. Officials adjusted records. Her movements were restricted. Her diet was controlled. Her servants were replaced, sometimes more than once. Not for her comfort, for security. Because a pregnant concubine was no longer just a woman. She was a container for potential power, and everyone noticed. Other concubines noticed first. Smiles became careful. Visits became polite and brief. Some offered congratulations, some offered gifts, and some offered distance. Because pregnancy did not inspire warmth, it inspired anxiety. Every other woman understood what this meant. One person had moved closer to the center, which meant everyone else was, by definition, further away. The palace treated pregnancy like a state project. Doctors monitored everything. Foods were measured. Schedules were enforced. The concubine herself had very little say. She was protected, observed, and isolated. Because isolation reduced variables, and the palace hated variables. But for all this attention, pregnancy was never secure. Childbirth was dangerous. Infant mortality was high, very high, which meant that even as a concubine's status rose, she lived in a state of constant tension. Every ache mattered. Every cough caused concern, and concern was never comforting. If the child was born alive, the next question arrived immediately. Boy or girl? This was not subtle. If the baby was a boy, the atmosphere shifted. The mother's rank rose. Her quarters improved. Her influence expanded. Not because she was suddenly respected, but because she was now useful. If the baby was a girl, the response was quieter, polite, controlled. The palace adjusted expectations downward, which is a very calm way of saying interest faded. If the child did not survive, then the palace grieved briefly. formally, and then it moved on. Records were updated, attention shifted, and the mother who had briefly stood closer to the center was gently, efficiently returned to the margins. This happened more often than history likes to dwell on, because it's unpleasant and inconvenient. Some women tried again. Some were not given the chance. A concubine who lost a child did not automatically regain favor. Sometimes she was quietly associated with bad luck, which is not an easy reputation to shake. A very small number of women succeeded spectacularly. They bore sons who lived, who grew, who were noticed, and if that son eventually became emperor, everything changed. These women became empress dowagers, which was, arguably, the most powerful position a woman could hold in imperial China. They had waited, and then they ruled. But these stories are remembered precisely because they were rare. For every famous empress dowager, there were hundreds of concubines whose pregnancies ended quietly, or whose sons died young, or whose daughters married off and vanished from records. Most women did not rise. They hovered, briefly illuminated by possibility, and then returned to shadow. What's striking is how emotionally restrained all of this was expected to be. Public grief was limited. Private despair was invisible. A concubine was expected to accept outcomes with composure, because harmony mattered more than heartbreak, and composure was survival. By the time a concubine reached her 30s, her chances diminished. Younger women arrived, fresher possibilities. The palace preferred hope over history, and so older concubines transitioned again, to teachers, to ritual specialists, to background figures. They carried memories no one asked about. In the next part, we'll drift toward the end of this cycle. Aging, irrelevance, and what happened to concubines once they were no longer useful to anyone at all. But not yet. For now, let your thoughts slow again. Imagine the quiet of the palace nursery, the careful footsteps, the held breath, and the knowledge shared by everyone that nothing here was guaranteed. We'll continue soon. By the time a concubine reached her late 20s or early 30s, something subtle occurred. No announcement, no ceremony, just a shift. People stopped looking quite as long. Messages arrived less often. Summons, if they ever came, stopped coming altogether. This was not a punishment. It was simply the system doing what it always did, replacing. The imperial harem had no concept of retirement. There was no celebration for years served, no gratitude for loyalty. A concubine did not finish her role. She slowly became irrelevant, which, in many ways, was worse. Younger women arrived regularly. They were trained the same way, dressed the same way, taught the same rules. They walked the same courtyards. Only now, older concubines watched them do it, with a strange mixture of sympathy and distance, because they remembered, and because remembering didn't help. As a concubine aged, she was often reassigned, moved farther from the center of the palace. Her quarters became quieter, smaller, colder in winter. She might be asked to teach etiquette to newcomers, how to bow, how to speak, how to survive. There was irony in this, passing on the skills of patience to women who still believed patience might be rewarded. Some concubines turned toward religion. Buddhism was common. Prayer offered structure when ambition no longer did. Chanting filled the long hours. So did silence. Others devoted themselves to ritual duties, maintaining shrines, preparing offerings, tasks that were important, but never important enough to be noticed. Friendships thinned. Women who had once waited together were scattered across the palace. Some had risen, some had fallen, some had died. Time in the harem did not bind people together. It separated them gently. Leaving the palace was still almost impossible. A concubine was, in legal terms, part of the imperial household. That status did not expire. Marriage outside the palace was rare. Returning to one's family was rarer. The world beyond the walls became something remembered, not revisited. Old age in the palace was quiet, not peaceful, quiet. Older concubines lived surrounded by routine, ritual, and repetition. Days blended together. Seasons passed. New emperors came and went, and still they remained. History does not record most of their names. It records outcomes, titles, ranks, births, but not the long middle years, the waiting, the watching, the slow acceptance that nothing more was coming. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling part. Not cruelty, not violence, but the calm efficiency with which the system absorbed entire lives and left almost no trace. So when we look back at ancient Chinese concubines, it's tempting to search for intrigue, plots, poison, power plays. And yes, those stories exist, but they are the exception. The rule was silence, routine, a life lived in preparation for something that rarely arrived. They woke, they dressed, they waited, and eventually, they faded. And with that, we'll let the palace rest. The lanterns dim, the corridors empty. Let your thoughts slow, let history blur at the edges. And if you've drifted somewhere between listening and sleep, then tonight has gone exactly as planned. Good night. By the time a concubine disappeared into the outer rooms of the palace, her story was effectively over. At least, that's how the system saw it. But history, being unreliable, selective, and occasionally bored, didn't always agree. Because while most concubines vanished quietly, a few left echoes, and echoes have a way of growing louder with time. Official records were precise. They listed titles, dates, promotions, births. They did not list boredom, loneliness, fear. They certainly did not list resentment. So later generations, faced with this silence, did what humans always do. They filled it in. Court historians wrote carefully, very carefully. They praised women who supported order, who upheld ritual, who did not cause trouble. Women who exercised power openly were complicated. Their ambition was rebranded as manipulation, their intelligence as cunning, their survival as danger. Because of course it was. This is how concubines became villains, or temptresses, or shadowy figures blamed for dynastic decline. It was easier than admitting the system itself was fragile. Much easier to say, she interfered, than to say, this entire arrangement was unsustainable. Popular stories leaned even further. Plays, poems, later novels. Suddenly, concubines were everywhere, scheming behind screens, whispering to emperors, poisoning rivals with delicate hands. Some of this was inspired by real women. Most of it was fantasy, but fantasy sticks. What rarely made it into these stories was the waiting. No one writes epics about waiting. No one stages operas about sitting quietly in a courtyard, watching leaves fall, wondering if this is it. But that was the reality. That was the dominant experience. Archaeology gives us fragments, personal items, hairpins, cosmetic containers, objects that once belonged to women whose names we will never know. And these objects are unremarkable, beautiful, but ordinary, which somehow makes them more powerful, because they suggest real lives lived in small moments, not grand conspiracies. Modern historians, when they look back, see the harem differently, not as a nest of intrigue, but as a system of extreme regulation, a place where women's lives were narrowed, organized, and managed in the name of stability, and where stability came at a very human cost. It's tempting to ask whether any of it was worth it. The silk, the architecture, the ritual. But that question doesn't really belong to the people who lived there. They didn't choose the system, they navigated it, quietly, carefully, day by day. And that's why their stories linger. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were restrained, because they reveal how power often works best when it doesn't need to shout. So when we picture ancient China's imperial concubines now, perhaps we can let go of the poisoned cups and whispered plots, and instead imagine something simpler. A woman adjusting her sleeves in the early morning light, a slow walk through a familiar courtyard, a life defined not by action, but by patience. And with that, we'll let the story rest. The palace has said all it can. Let your thoughts drift where they want to go now. History will still be here tomorrow, quietly waiting. Good night. By now, the palace feels familiar. The corridors, the schedules, the silence. So it may come as a surpriser, very gentle one, that a few concubines did, technically, leave. Not often, not easily, and almost never in the way anyone would envy. But it happened, rarely. Sometimes, an emperor died young. This caused problems, administrative problems, succession problems, and concubine problems. Because when an emperor died, his concubines did not automatically become free. Of course not. That would have been convenient. Instead, most were reassigned to the palace of the next ruler, or transferred to secluded residences where they would spend the rest of their lives praying for the soul of a man they barely knew. Romantic. In a few dynasties, particularly during times of reform, panic-holder concubines were allowed to leave the palace. Allowed is doing a lot of work here. They were sent back to families they hadn't seen in decades, families that may not even exist anymore. They returned as strangers, with manners no one needed, skills no one valued, and memories no one wanted to hear. Freedom, it turns out, is complicated when you've been trained for captivity. Some concubines married afterward. This was rare, and awkward. They were older, politically sensitive, and socially unusual. People didn't quite know what to do with women who had once belonged to the emperor. Neither did the women themselves. Other concubines chose a different exit. Religion. Taking vows was one of the few socially acceptable ways to step sideways out of palace life. Buddhist nunneries offered structure, routine, silence, which, conveniently, these women already knew how to handle. For some, this was a relief. For others, just a quieter version of the same thing. Then there were the small rebellions. No uprisings, no speeches, just refusal. A concubine who stopped trying to impress, who dressed plainly on purpose, who became aggressively uninteresting. A woman who redirected her energy inward, into art, into study, into spiritual practice. This was not freedom, but it was control, a narrow, personal kind. Some women formed deep friendships, not alliances, not political arrangements, actual friendships. These were risky. Attachment made loss harder, but it also made the days bearable. Two women walking the same courtyard, sharing tea, sharing silence, in a place designed to isolate, that mattered. There were also women who resisted by remembering, keeping mental records, names, dates, stories that would never be written down, but would be passed quietly from one person to another. History beneath history. And then there were the women who simply endured. No exit, no rebellion, just presence, which is not nothing. Surviving a system designed to erase individuality is, in itself, a form of defiance, even if no one applauds, especially then. So if part 4 was about fading, and part 5 was about memory, then part 6 is about the thin, quiet space in between, where life continued. Not dramatically, but honestly. As we move toward the end of this long, slow story, there's one final thing to sit with. Not what these women achieved, but what they were denied. Choice, movement, noise, and how, despite that, they still found ways, small, imperfect ways to remain human. Let the palace fade again. Stone walls dissolving into darkness, lanterns dimming. And if you're still awake, that's okay. History isn't finished with you yet. We'll take one last gentle turn soon. When we step back very slowly from the palace, something becomes clear. Nothing about this system relied on cruelty alone. That's the unsettling part. It relied on routine. The imperial concubine system worked, not because it was dramatic, but because it was boring. Endlessly, reliably, predictably boring. Days followed schedules, lives followed rules, and within that structure, individuality dissolved, not violently, but politely, which is often more effective. Most concubines did not suffer spectacularly. They weren't constantly punished. They weren't always afraid. They were simply managed. And management, over decades, reshapes a person. Think about how much of their lives happened internally. Thoughts never spoken. Opinions never asked for. Choices never offered. A lifetime of restraint leaves very little visible evidence, which is why history struggles to describe it. From the outside, the palace appears still, orderly. From the inside, it was full of people quietly negotiating with time, waiting for something to change, waiting for permission, waiting for relevance, waiting, mostly, for the day to end. The system did not require villains. It did not require constant scheming. It simply required compliance, and compliance was taught gently, early, and thoroughly. When modern audiences look back, there's often a temptation to search for meaning, to ask what these women contributed, to wonder if their lives mattered. But that question already assumes a system that measured worth fairly. This one didn't. Their lives mattered because they were lived, not because they changed the course of history. Most people don't, and that doesn't make their experiences any less real. The palace did not collapse because of concubines. It didn't thrive because of them either. They were part of the machinery, and machinery doesn't remember its components. What remains now are impressions: a quiet courtyard, footsteps fading down a stone corridor, lantern light on silk sleeves, moments without witnesses. And perhaps that's the most honest way to remember them, not as archetypes, not as villains or victims, but as people who woke up each morning, followed the rules, and lived the only life available to them. So as we let this story finally come to rest, there's no moral to announce, no lesson to underline, just a gentle acknowledgement that history is made not only by those who act loudly, but by those who endure quietly. The palace settles, the lights go out, and the past, as always, stays where it is, waiting. Good night. Long after the concubines are gone, Long after their names stop appearing in records, the palace remains, at least for a while. Stone walls don't forget immediately. Courtyards hold silence the way fabric holds scent. If you walked through the inner palace decades later, you wouldn't hear stories. You'd hear echoes, footsteps that aren't there anymore, doors opening out of habit, wind moving through empty halls that once held lives measured in waiting. History often focuses on moments of collapse. A dynasty ends, a rebellion succeeds, a palace burns. But most palaces don't end like that. They are repurposed, renamed, quietly abandoned wing by wing, which feels appropriate, because that's how the people inside them lived. The rooms where concubines once dressed are eventually reassigned to servants, to storage, to nothing at all. Silk curtains are removed, furniture is replaced, and slowly the space forgets what it was for. Later generations walk through these buildings and imagine drama. They imagine whispered plots, secret meetings, hidden passions. They don't imagine long afternoons with nothing to do, or the strange exhaustion of doing very little for an entire lifetime. If the palace becomes a ruin, vines grow where schedules once ruled. Rain falls into courtyards that were once scrubbed daily, and the quiet changes from controlled silence to natural silence, which is softer. This is where the concubines finally gain something they never had: anonymity without supervision. No one watching, no one ranking, no one counting their usefulness. Just time doing what time always does, erasing edges. When historians reconstruct these lives, they do it carefully, from fragments, from regulations, from things written about women, not by them, which means something is always missing, and perhaps it always will be, but maybe that's all right. Not every life needs to be fully understood to be respected. Some lives are meant to be acknowledged quietly, and then left to rest. So as we drift away from the palace one last time, there's nothing left to solve, no mystery to untangle, no lesson to extract, just a long, quiet system that existed, and then didn't. Imagine the walls in moonlight, empty still, and imagine just briefly the relief of no longer being expected to wait. Let your thoughts loosen now. Let history fade into background noise. You don't need to remember everything. The past has already done its part. Good night. If you're still listening, you're probably not here for facts anymore. You're here for the rhythm, the steady movement of words that don't ask anything from you, which is fitting because that's how most of the people in this story lived. Time, in the palace, moved strangely. Days were long, years were short. A woman might arrive young, hopeful, terrified, and leave old, or not leave at all, without ever feeling like anything had happened, which is difficult to explain and even harder to accept. But time outside the palace moves differently. It smooths things. It turns systems into footnotes, lives into statistics, silence into absence, and absence into nothing, which sounds bleak, but it's also peaceful. For the concubines, forgetting may have been the kindest ending. No one arguing about their intentions, no one rewriting their lives into cautionary tales, just a gradual dissolving into history's background hum. When we remember them now, we don't need to imagine every detail. We don't need to reconstruct every rule. We only need to acknowledge that they existed, that they waited, that they lived inside something larger than themselves, and did what they could with it. And now, as you lie there, or sit there, or drift somewhere in between, there's nothing left to hold on to. No cliffhangers, no unresolved drama, just a long exhale. History has been telling stories for thousands of years. Tonight, it doesn't need to finish one. It just needs to stop speaking. So let the words blur, let names vanish, let palaces crumble into dust and moonlight. And if sleep comes now, that's exactly right. Good night. By now, there's nothing left to explain. The palace is gone. The people are gone. Even the memory of them has softened into something vague and distant. All that remains is the feeling, and even that is fading. History, when you sit with it long enough, does this. It stops being informative, stops being tragic, stops being interesting, and becomes background. Like rain you notice only when it stops. The concubines don't need to be analyzed anymore. They don't need sympathy. They don't need judgment. They are beyond all of that now. Time has finished its work. If this were a different kind of story, we'd end with meaning, a lesson, a warning, a moral neatly folded at the bottom. But life rarely does that, and sleep certainly doesn't. So instead, we end with permission. Permission to stop listening. Permission to let the words slide past without holding them. Permission to rest. Imagine the palace one last time, not as it was, but as it feels now. No walls, no rules, no waiting. Just open space, quiet, your breathing slows. The story loosens its grip, and history, so often loud, demanding, unfinished, finally becomes still. There's nothing more coming. No surprise endings, no hidden chapters, just the gentle knowledge that everything you needed from this story you already received. Let the voice fade, let the silence settle, and wherever you drift next, sleep, thought, or nothing at all, that's exactly where you're meant to be. Good night. Now, imagine the palace completely empty, lanterns extinguished, courtyards silent, even the wind seems to tiptoe. All the concubines have gone, some vanished into obscurity, some left faint traces, some were forgotten entirely, and yet the memory of them lingers, not as drama, not as scandal, but as presence. A reminder that history is made up of countless lives lived quietly, lives unnoticed, lives patient, lives measured in the soft passing of days. There's a lesson here, though subtle, not one you need to solve, not one you need to repeat. It's this: endurance has its own dignity, even when it's invisible, even when it leaves almost no record, even when the world has stopped noticing. Think of the courtyards once more, the empty corridors, the still water in the palace ponds, the gentle sway of silk curtains in a draftless room. This is where the story lives now, in absence, in calm, in quiet memory. As you listen, your breathing slows, your mind softens. The boundaries between now and then blur. The palace, the people, the waiting, they all dissolve into nothing but gentle shapes at the edges of thought. There is no ending because the ending already happened, and there is no moral because life, like history, is rarely tidy. What remains is simply space. Space for thought, space for rest, space for sleep. So let the words fall away, let the silence deepen, and let yourself drift. History is still here, quietly waiting, and tonight, so are you. Good night. By now, we've walked corridors where nothing happened. We've watched lives measured in waiting. We've seen the subtle shifts in rank, the rare moments of attention from emperors, the pregnancies, the small rebellions, and finally, the fading into irrelevance. But there's another piece to consider, one that most histories never mention: routine, repetition, the slow accumulation of ordinary days. The palace ran on them, not on intrigue, not on drama, on daily tasks repeated endlessly: waking before sunrise, dressing, practicing bows, eating meals at scheduled times, walking through courtyards, sitting quietly, waiting, and then doing it again the next day, and the next, and the next. For a concubine, mastery of routine was survival. The smallest deviation could bring misfortune, the smallest compliance could bring favor, and the line between the two was often invisible. They learned to move through days like water through a narrow channel, slowly, smoothly, without making a splash. Even in leisure, routine persisted. Playing musical instruments, practicing calligraphy, reciting poetry, maintaining the palace gardens. These were not hobbies. They were exercises in endurance, in control, in quiet excellence. Sometimes, the monotony was broken. A rare imperial visit, a promotion, a ceremony. But these were exceptions. Brief disruptions in a life designed to stay contained. And after the event, everything returned to normal. Quiet, orderly, predictable. And yet, within this repetition, there was a subtle power. The women learned to observe, to understand, to anticipate. They memorized the schedules of the eunuchs, the moods of the consorts, the habits of the emperor, and even though the system constrained them, knowledge of the system gave them a form of agency. Soft, slow, careful agency. History often overlooks these small competencies. It prefers the dramatic, the visible, the sensational. Bet for the women of the harem, competence mattered more than drama. A steady hand, a calm demeanor, a memorized rule followed perfectly, because these were the tools that preserved life, status, and sometimes a small measure of dignity. And as you listen, picture it: the long repetition, the measured footsteps, the silk brushing against polished floors, the soft rustle of fans, and the gentle tick of the hours as they passed, day after day. There is something strangely hypnotic about repetition. It softens the edges of experience. It lulls the mind into quiet observation. And perhaps that is why it is so easy to imagine yourself here, slowly, patiently, enduring. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into the quiet strategies these women developed. How, within the strict confines of the palace, they learned to navigate life, to survive, and occasionally, in the smallest ways, to resist. But for now, let your thoughts float gently along the palace corridors. Feel the weight of ordinary days settling softly around you. Good night. By now, we've seen the waiting, the hierarchy, the pregnancies, and the fading into irrelevance. But life inside the palace wasn't just about endurance. It was also about navigation, because the system was strict but not perfect. Gaps existed, opportunities appeared quietly, in small ways, and a few women learned to use them. The first strategy was invisibility. Not ignoring, exactly, not defiance, just blending into the background. Move silently, bow appropriately, speak only when necessary, smile softly, keep thoughts to yourself. This was not weakness, it was preservation, a conscious, careful choice to remain unnoticed, because sometimes survival is the only power you can wield. The second strategy was observation. Every gesture, every word, every movement mattered. Eunuchs' moods, consorts' schedules, the emperor's attention patterns. A woman who watched carefully could anticipate changes, prepare in advance, protect herself from sudden punishment. Knowledge became armor, subtle, invisible armor. The third strategy was alliances. Friendships weren't for political gain. They weren't networks of power, not always. They were companions in a life designed to isolate, sharing food, whispering about small annoyances, exchanging tiny bits of information. In a place where silence was enforced, friendship became its own quiet rebellion. Fourth, we find small acts of personal expression. A hairpin worn differently, a pattern embroidered on a sleeve, a poem written in private, a calligraphy exercise done just for oneself. None of this changed rank, none of this altered history, but it allowed a woman to claim a fragment of herself, a fragment the palace could not control. Finally, there was patience. This is perhaps the most underestimated strategy of all. To live decades in the same walls, repeating the same motions, under the same rules, requires mastery of time itself. A patient woman could endure slights, setbacks, and erasure. She could outlast intrigue, survive jealousy, and weather the slow erosion of favor. Patience was quiet power, invisible, reliable, uncelebrated. When all of these strategies were combined, a concubine could navigate life inside the palace with minimal harm. She might never gain favor. She might never be remembered. She might never see her son resort, even live. But she would endure, and endurance mattered. It's tempting, from the outside, to imagine only the drama, poisoned cups, secret plots, scheming behind silk curtains. But these were rare. The reality was slower, quieter, more meticulous. A woman surviving day after day, hour after hour, using observation, patience, discretion, and small acts of self-expression. And as you drift along this story, imagine it. Footsteps soft on stone floors, curtains rustling in a gentle draft, lantern light pooling on polished wood, voices speaking only when required, a life constrained, and yet quietly claimed in small ways. In the next part, we'll begin to consider the final stage, aging, legacy, and what little trace these women left behind. The part where history mostly forgets but memory lingers anyway. For now, let your thoughts wander softly through empty halls. Feel the quiet patience that shaped entire lifetimes. Good night.